our belief and what we've learned is that in any system there is a day of reckoning. And when you don't want to care for the poor, and when we look at health care, let's see what happens. Typically, what's more expensive, preventative care or emergency care? And so let's look at exactly what's happening in Texas. The Code Red report was released earlier this year. Basically, it was a report of doctors that analyzed the critical condition of health care. Current trends in delivery of health care will inevitably exacerbate current problems, overdependence on emergency rooms to access primary care. It is the most expensive means of delivering care. So what happens? Uninsured person goes to ER because they don't have health insurance. They can't pay their hospital bills. The hospital's got to recoup their losses from somewhere, so they do it from clients who pay, which then gets passed on to insurance companies, which then causes them to raise premiums, which then causes employers to have to pay higher premiums, which then allows them to have less coverage because they basically can't afford to insure all their employees, which then means employees can't afford primary care, which then means they go to the emergency room. And so, same thing happens in indigent defense. Person who's indigent is arrested. They can't bond out, and so they're stuck in jail. The county then pays money to feed and house them. They ask for a lawyer in Travis County. Thankfully, they get one. But typically, the client wants to get out of jail, so they plead guilty as fast as they can. And the reason for the underlying arrest may never be addressed. If it was homelessness, if it was another situation about mental illness or substance abuse, the conviction then makes it harder for them to get employment or housing or benefits or social services. The government then, at that point, has to pay them for unemployment or Social Security or disability. The instability continues until the next crisis, which basically results them into poor choices or police involvement, leading to a further arrest. Nothing changes. Okay? These problems have existed for years, and although we have ambitions to think that we can change them, we're pretty realistic in terms of thinking that it's not going to happen overnight. But we do think there's got to be a better solution to the kind of reactionary methods that are happening. For years, families of clients who are in prison cannot afford the cost of collect calls. Evercom and the other companies have a virtual monopoly on what those costs cost. So what happens? People smuggle cell phones into the prison from prison guards that are paid too little. As a result, it's not until somebody starts ringing Whitmire's office that then it becomes a major crisis and people start doing things about it. So now, even though the prisons have a budget of $2.9 billion, they get to immediately demand $66 million additional dollars to combat a problem with cell phones. It's not about guns or knives or drugs or anything else in prison. It's just about human contact. People can't afford to call their mom or their wife. They just made phone calls. And that's now what we must stop. But that gets the $66 million. Don't call Whitmire either. But that gets the money, and indigent defense at this point becomes another thing that we'll deal with later. Okay? So what does a private law firm attempt to do in terms of solving the situation? A couple things. We're not saying we can solve everything. But we do think there's at least a couple of solutions that we can do through the Open Door Initiative. Okay? The first is holistic advocacy, and it's done through it's taken us a while to kind of figure out a model of social work. And the notion is that the system requires and assumes that the individual is going to change because they were arrested. The system assumes that they will recognize that they need to change because they were arrested, and that the system assumes that the arrest and prosecution is only the incentive you need. There's no tools, it's just basically a punishment system altogether. And we think it begs the question, if you had that level of insight, if you had that level of understanding, if you understood why you needed to change because things were going bad, would you necessarily be in the system to begin with? And so what if you look at who has the greatest access to clients and who in the entire criminal justice system has the most undivided loyalty to clients and who the client is most likely to trust? Presumably it's supposed to be us. And if we harness this power of that relationship to assess a client's needs at the beginning, and if we treated the arrest like a legal emergency, like we do a medical emergency, then at that point, if you could mimic a team approach just like the emergency room technicians do, you could probably do a lot more. And so what we will launch through the Open Door Initiative is a series of both information as well as through our website, which is an open source documentation of all the work that we've done for assessment and rehabilitation tools, is explaining this model. The model is basically this. You first determine if there are legal problems that are related to external factors, which may be better addressed in a different system, basically outside the criminal justice system. You then make appropriate referrals to those systems to prevent the system of punishment from spending money where other service providers could be taking the lead, and then you develop a treatment plan at the beginning of representation instead of at the end of representation. You then use a cross-disciplinary approach of lawyers and social workers that are better to address chemical dependency issues, mental health issues, employment, and you continue representing them until they are out of the system, but you also have a relationship so if there is a problem a year, a 2-year, 5 years, 10 years down the road, they go back to the lawyer as the point of contact and back to that law office as a point of contact. Now, the problem right now is that lawyers who take indigent cases have some limitations. We're pretty good at spotting legal issues. We're not nearly as good as being able to look for social issues. And even when we do, we don't really know what to do with them. I mean, my training wasn't fundamentally in being able to address or counsel clients that are mentally ill. I can try to learn better, but there's a whole profession that does nothing but that's being underutilized. And furthermore, although I look at a client insofar as they're one case, a social worker is more likely to look at that client as a whole person. And that makes a tremendous difference when dealing with the needs that are far more sophisticated than someone's arrest for criminal trespass or possession of marijuana. Okay? Many lawyers believe they didn't go to law school to be a social worker, and so there is a certain amount of resistance in our profession to be able to do the hand-holding that's needed in a lot of these cases. If it created some long-term incentive, it might make a big difference. And when you look at what social workers do, they're less expensive than lawyers. They're more likely to try to solve the underlying reason someone's in the system. They're more likely to then know the community resources so that the criminal justice dollars aren't being spent, and the county is able to use nonprofits and other people to be able to use faith-based initiatives. And they went to social workers to be social workers, and we're simply not using them as well as we can in the system like they are otherwise. Do they magically break the cycle? No. But there are two ways it can play out. You can continue to spend money to process people, or you can invest in a solution. And at this point, we think it's a double victory, because the more successful people are about coming out of the system, then the less we pay to process them. And if you want to even look at it in the most brutal capitalistic mechanism, the greater tax revenues they have because they're earning a job, they're paying into the system as compared to the system paying them. So what our method is to do the following. There's a certain number of folks that are at the bottom of the barrel that the system already takes care of. But when you look at folks that are above that, you've got some problems. And like the retail businesses, professional services are hurting just as well, because we depend upon clients to basically have money to pay their service fees. But unlike retail industries, we can't really have a sale. You can't really advertise a divorce for $99.99 on a Friday afternoon. I mean, you can. It's just kind of tacky. But the point is, there's no mechanism right now when the economy dips for solo practitioners or small law firms to be able to make a living in the sense of, other than getting back to the court-appointed list, which is what's happening right now. Everybody scrambles to get back for government appointments instead of being able to find a different solution. And so it provides a stable form of cash flow, but we've got a better idea.